So this is domain 2, which is information risk management. So those basic things we've covered, we'll continue and understand how it relates to the course here. Not a very difficult domain, but let's look at this. Okay, so risk management concept, right? So what is risk management? And as I said before, this is one of the most important aspect of your information security management. We generally start off with risk management. And so this is about identifying your assets and the risks that the assets have, and then ensuring that you have proper, you mitigate those risks as per table levels, right? So, and we ensure that it stays, those controls and risks stay in that below that acceptable level. So that's what we're going to do, and we'll discuss about in detail. And so obviously the risk management programs are again unique. It's not the same for every organization. It is different, and so it's written down here as well. Just write down. It says the program is dependent on the support from executive management. I've talked about this. The senior management response support is always the topmost priority, and also the culture. Is how the organization's culture is important with respect to security awareness or accountability. Are they very serious about security? They're not, and all of those things matter. So the security programs or the risk management rather depends on various things like the culture, mission, objective goals, management support, management structure, industry sectors, market conditions, existing laws, regulations, and legal obligations, stated or unstated risk tolerance, and the financial health. All of these things matter because obviously finance, money also matters. If you do not have enough money to spend, then obviously you might want to avoid some of the activities. So outcomes of risk management will ensure that risk management will ensure that we understand what our risks are, and we have more controls in place. After having a proper risk management, understanding where the risks are, then we can have proper controls in place. We know what to do with those risks. Okay. And so they have a lower probability of security incidents. That's what you want to do. But better people are prepared with proper controls in place. We try to reduce the security incidents below the acceptable levels. So, okay, so that's what we want to do here. Again, so not going into too much of these specific things. We'll discuss some of them, but we don't have to get into too much of these concepts here. So we definitely look into various different concepts like having controls in place to ensure that your specific risks are mitigated. Okay, for example, IDS or IPS or network or firewalls and access management, anti-malware, single sign-on, whatever. All of these things are some of the ways we can control. Now, how many of these things are comfortable to you? How many of these things you understand? Access governance systems, access management systems, advanced anti-malware.
Access governance systems, is that the same thing as identity access management, or PAMs, FIMs, forensic tools, GRC systems, IDS, IPS, I think I know PAM, public key infrastructure, SIEM, which you showed me. Those things I don't know, the one that I mentioned.
Okay.
Single sign-on, yeah.
Okay. These terms, huh?
VPN, I do know. Yeah, yeah.
Okay. No, sorry. Do you know what single sign-on or not?
I know what it means. We're trying to implement it in one of my projects, but I don't know the single sign-on system. I'm not.
Okay. And VPN? Okay, fair enough. I think that's fine. So as far as the exam is concerned, you don't have to get into these details. They don't have to know. This is just some examples that they provided. So, for example, it talks about file activity monitoring systems or file integrity monitoring systems. They're usually, the same thing. It does both the tasks like watching and monitoring your files and ensure that anybody who accesses it, that those things are being recorded, or access controls are being implemented, and so on. Again, these are various kinds of systems. I mean, this is not specific technology, but very specific vendor, but specific technology, right? The intrusion detection systems or intrusion prevention systems, we have these kind of systems in place. The PKI, it's about the digital certificates. Now, we're not going to get into those details too much, but we'll discuss some of these things in the next domain, I think, or even in this one as well. So we'll touch upon some of them, but if you don't know many of these things, that is also fine, because they're not going to ask you very specific questions on this. Okay, but this is just to show an example as to, yes, risk management would require a lot of things. Okay, so one of the first thing you need to do is probably implement a risk management program within the organization. Okay, so to have this thing, one of the first thing you need to do is have this, the senior management support, top-down approach. Remember, so that you begin from there. You prepare policy, etc. And then another thing you can also do is also take a risk management framework. Okay, so we'll talk about some of them. A framework will help you so that you do not have to build anything from scratch. Okay, so there are lots of frameworks. We'll talk about them, and whichever one is applicable, we can implement that. Again, we talked about risk appetite, I suppose, right? So the organization's tolerance to risk, how much risk are they able to observe? That's something that you need to understand. Again, it's a very high level understanding, risk appetite. Or you also need to understand the regulatory and the legal requirements. Okay, now we have to, again, the senior management has to establish the acceptable risks. What is acceptable, what is not acceptable, and these are usually specific numbers, could be in percentage or in terms of the number value, and accordingly the actions will be taken. We'll talk about this a little later on now, how these what to do with risk acceptance. We'll discuss that. Again, as I said, these are some of the factors which will matter in terms of risk management. So culture, organizational maturity, management structure, management support, market conditions, legal and regulatory requirements. Again, there's nothing to memorize here, just to give you an idea as to what will happen, or what are the things that you may need to consider. Okay, nothing to memorize, just pointers. But just be aware of these things, right? Culture, all this matters, market conditions matters, the regulatory, legal requirements matters. The other thing we need to also consider is the communication. So this is not, risk is not a, something which needs to be hidden. So the appropriate stakeholders have to be aware of the risks and the activities that are being performed to mitigate those risks. And a proper risk management implementation in the organization requires everybody's to be involved in it. It cannot be done in a silo. So a proper risk communication is very important. So who does it, how it's to be done? Well, that is something that can certainly discuss. Okay, so which means there might be risk awareness programs. Okay, so the appropriate people are made aware of the risk awareness. What are the existing risks? For example, it's mentioned here. The goal of risk awareness is to ensure that business leaders and decision makers are aware of the idea that all business decisions have a risk component, and that many decisions have implications on the information risk, right? So everything that is done will have an implication on the risk, and they need to be aware of it. So whatever they do, if they include hire a new person, for example, or bring a new technology, or build a new process, whatever it is, buy a new application, all of them have a fair amount of risk which can expose the organization. So they need to be aware of it. And this becomes a part of the system. We'll talk about this later on, the change management, which needs to be integrated very properly with the risk management. We'll talk about that. And as a security manager, you can also be a consultant, risk consultant. Okay, so be able to tell them your expert opinion as to what are the risks and how you're going to handle those things and what to do and all this stuff. So again, it's important, as I said, every business is different. So you need to understand the business structure, the culture, and the requirement, and tell them about the general practices. But also, first of all, understand these, as you need to listen and understand, and then assess the existing environment, the culture, the existing risks. Again, nothing important here. It's just about is saying you may have to act as a risk consultant.
Mhm.
So we need to understand. So what are the first thing? Okay, so even in the question when it comes in, when you want to implement something, what the first thing that you need to do? And the principle here is that you need to first understand. So you need to understand what the organization is, their goals, their missions, their requirements. So that's the first thing you will do always. And then after that, you can maybe do a risk assessment and then implement a framework, etc. But the first thing you always do will understand, right? So even when you're consulting, you first of all you will need to be able to understand. That's the first thing you'll always do. And there's a key attributes required to be a good risk consultant is to be ability to listen to business leaders, ability to assess the information and how it may impact the process of business unit. So you need to be able to identify all of those things. And so it's not just about technology, because as I said before, there has to be an alignment, and that is something that is tested all across the domain. That it's not just about technology or security. It's about being able to understand and align that with the business. And so here we go. We have risk management frameworks. Some of them, we'll talk about some of them. 27001, ISO 27001 is one of the best security frameworks out there. Not specific with risk, but it contains a risk element as well. It has many other things. But 27005 is more focused on the information security risk management. So this is something which can be used along with 27001. Then there is 31010 risk assessment techniques. NIST has 837. They have another one called 835, 839. So some of these things are freely available. And if we look at 839, let's take a look at this. So this one would be a PDF, I suppose. So in these documents, I would have mentioned this before, they're all absolutely free of cost, and I highly recommend that you go with this. And so this is obviously a very technical and detailed book. Some of them are a little advanced, but I think most of the basic things would be important. I think we talked about some of these things. I'll come back and discuss some of these processes. Okay, but it's a good resource. NIST documents are always good, worth looking into. COVID is another one I've talked about. Sorry. Okay, COVID is another one I talked about. COVID currently is 2019. They've just released that. Risk maturity model, facilitated risk assessment process, and there are many others which are there. We'll talk about some of them briefly. So the idea here is that there are plenty of options available to implement any risk management framework, and you can absolutely pick and choose what you need. Again, these are again, so we can just go over this. This is not very difficult or not so important. So what basically is saying, you need to consider the internal environments, you need to consider the external environments. Okay, so nothing to memorize here. We know all of these internal environments like organization missions and existing business strategies and so on, or the external environment like the law, like the market conditions or the legal requirements or the geopolitical factors, external threats, and so on. These are another thing that you need to consider. So when you perform a risk assessment, we need to consider all of these things. And obviously, this is not an exhaustive list, and neither is this an exhaustive list. Okay, so and I think we also talked about gap analysis the other day. Have we discussed this? Gap analysis is, again, same thing, trying to understand what the gap is. And I am pretty sure, I think you've done that multiple times, right? So understanding what the gap is and where you want to be. And so then how do you go there? That's the second. After this, you'll understand. And because if wherever you think you need a little more explanation, just let me know, right? So I'm just going to focus on important points. Again, it's not external support. Again, nothing very important here. Basically, it's saying that when you are implementing a risk management program, you might want to have external support as well, and that's fair enough. You can have experts coming in, or if within your own team members, they can provide you with support, with the knowledge and the skills that others might also have. Okay, so all of these things are, and there's again nothing to memorize here. Like we have IC square, ISACA. This is ISACA and all those stuff. CSA for cloud security, and many of them have publications. There are many sources where you can get information. Again, just give it a read. Nothing to memorize here. Okay, so many of these companies have reports you can refer to. Many of them provide advisory services. There are consulting firms. Some of them provide trainings. There are lots of books that you can read through. There are conferences, online, offline, whatever. Okay, so just give it a read. Again, nothing to memorize here, nothing that very important. This is important. So the risk management life cycle. Okay, so as I said before, this has to start with a policy. It starts from there. And the policy we talked about may have the scope, the objectives, the roles and responsibilities, and the consequences, and all the procedures, workflows, business rules, and so on, right? Standards, procedures, guidelines. We talked about those things, I think. So the other day we discussed those things. They're all part of this. So always begin with a high-level risk management, and then obviously understanding the assets. So we'll understand that. So let's get in a little more detail. So once you have in a risk management process, then there's a structured way of doing certain things to understand the risk and then manage those risks, right? That's what you do. Understand the risk, then you manage it, and then you monitor the risk. So these are the three things that generally does. We'll talk about this. The scope definition, okay, that's one of the first thing you do. So what does risk management mean? So that's usually part of the process. Also in the policy, you have the scope. You can define like this applies to this or that. Okay, so whatever it is, so you have to be very careful about the scope. And without the scope, then there is ambiguity. You may not know, is this apply to all my businesses, or a specific business, or a specific vertical, or a specific group of people, or a specific application? So whatever it is, you have to understand and define these assets. The risk scope is very important. And the next is asset identification and valuation. We'll talk about this in a while. Risk appetite. Okay, so we'll discuss this again. Risk identification. Okay, so we'll discuss this in a little more detail. And the risk analysis. Okay, so analyzing the risk. Maybe there's some calculations. We'll look at the calculations also. There are quantitative and qualitative analysis. We'll discuss that. And then once you do that, then we perform risk treatment, and we'll discuss that also in detail. Okay, and finally, we can communicate that risk to everybody. Okay, so that's a very holistic thing that we will do in terms of the risk management process. We will get into each of these points and discuss them in a little more detail.